So it looks like the Hebrew word usually means test, not tempt, whereas the Greek word usually could mean either tempt or test. Question I want to answer today, I was in a study and somebody asked about, does God tempt anyone? Does God tempt anyone? And they were talking about James, and where James explicitly says God tempts no man. But they then went to Genesis, where God tests Abraham. So I want to read those passages, and I just want to talk about that topic briefly, because somebody asked it in the study, and I thought it was a good question. So just brief discussion. James 1:13-14. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Okay? So there's the specific passage, and it says explicitly, God doesn't tempt anyone. And the person brought up, they tried to compare this to Genesis. And, well, really, again, God's testing. So let's just go ahead and look in the Bible. Let's look for the word test. So here's Genesis 22:1, the common passage that's brought up. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Here I am." And he replied. And this is when God requires Abraham to sacrifice his son, which ultimately he doesn't force him to follow through on, but he needed to be willing to do it. So we've got that passage, Genesis 22:1, in regards to God testing. And it's not the only passage like it. There are several passages that seem to indicate God tests. 1 Corinthians 10:13 has an interesting idea in it. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. So God doesn't tempt you. God doesn't tempt is one important idea that we come across here. The next important idea we come across is God tests Abraham. That's an important concept. And then 1 Corinthians 10:13, God makes a way out through temptation. So, how would you guys put these together? God doesn't tempt, but then in Genesis, God tests. So, is there a difference between testing and tempting? What is the definitions of the words in their original languages? Very good question. So let's look into that. So let's look at Genesis 22:1 in both Hebrew and Greek. So here is our word study in the Hebrew.
Nisa.
Nisa. So Nisa. And in the Septuagint, peirazo.
Peirazo.
Peirazo. So let's now look in James. Look at it, guys. Peirazo. It's the exact same Greek word. Medes peirazamenos, legeto hati apa theou peirazamai. Hagar theos, epeirastos. Look, it's just over and over and over. Guys, we're in trouble. Coolblay said the King James translates it tempt in both cases, but you know what? The Greek translates it tempt in both cases. So, we have encountered a pickle. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Sounds like the King James was rendering the Greek appropriately. Now that is the Septuagint. So let's look at the semantic domain of Nisa in Hebrew. Often tested, or testing, 22 of 35 times. Also put to the test, tried, used, venture, or did. So those are all of the uses. Tested, or testing is the common way it's put. But clearly, the translators of the Septuagint thought that peirazo was the best Greek rendering of the word. How do we resolve this apparent contradiction, guys? Genesis 22:1 explicitly says God tempted or tested Abraham. He peirazoed Abraham. Whereas James explicitly says God does not peirazo anyone. So how can God peirazo Abraham in Genesis 22 and yet in James 1:13 not peirazo anyone? So we need to look at context. Let's look at some other passages where it has it. Exodus 16:4. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. Exodus 17:7. And he called the place Massa and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? They tested the Lord. Numbers 14:22, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times. Do not put the Lord your God to the test as you did at Massa. So here, God's even described as testing Israel pretty thoroughly. Kublai says, in my study Bible, it says the Greek word peirazo means both tempt and test, which is, I guess, what was echoed here. So it looks like the Hebrew word usually means test, not tempt, whereas the Greek word usually could mean either tempt or test. And you're right about that, Kublai. If you look at the semantic domain of peirazo, 14 uses tempt and 13 uses test. So you can see peirazo does look like it can be test or tempt, whereas the Hebrew looks like it's more along the lines of testing. To check this theory, let's see if the word test in the Old Testament uses a different Hebrew word. Excuse me, not test, tempt. It doesn't even look like the word tempt is used in the Old Testament. They're almost always test. We did discover something useful. That is this. Hebrew word in Genesis 22:1 usually means test. Greek word in LXX and James 1:13 usually means or can mean either test or tempt. So then the question becomes, what does James mean and how does it differ from Genesis 22:1? That's the big question we need to answer at this point. Okay, now let's go to the context of each passage then. And let's read the passage in its context and try to determine, not using word studies or anything like that, but let's just try to ask ourselves, is there a difference in kind between how it's used in both contexts? So let's first go to Genesis 22:1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. And then he tells him to go sacrifice his son and essentially then provides the ram as a sacrifice on his behalf. This is the context of the tempting or testing of Abraham. Tests or tempts him to sacrifice his own son. He says he'd be willing to do it, but ultimately God provides the ram. Now let's go look at James 1:13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Now, something I noticed distinctively about both passages is this phrase evil, right here. It's kakos in Greek, kakon here, and evil down here. This is evil desire. It's all one word, epithumia. So, the evil aspect is something that's not really included in Abraham's context of Genesis 22:1, whereas evil is mentioned twice here, evil and evil desire. Okay? I think that's relevant. So the question becomes, in what way is Abraham being tempted that isn't to evil, and in what way is James saying that when God tempts us, he doesn't tempt us to evil? Richard says, tempting is usually a sinful act, whereas testing by God is strengthening our faith. I like that. I think that's good. Redness says, I like that. Yeah, very nice. Furious, in Genesis 22:1, is it more a sense of testing or proving, whereas in James 1:13, it's more about tempting towards sin? I think you're right, Furious. I think you're absolutely right. Let's go back to James 1:15. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. God cannot be tempted by evil. Notice the clarification here. God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, implying with evil. Look at that context. He doesn't tempt anyone. Tempt anyone for what? By evil or towards evil, but each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. I think that's a very key idea. And I think you're right, Richard, about strengthening our faith with testing. So the big difference, do you guys think it's appropriate then to say temptation or being tempted is always towards a sinful act, to act in an evil manner? Whereas testing is something God does to us, but God will never test us to commit evil. So if God tempts us or tests us, it's in the way of testing or tempting our faith, our growth, our development, our character. Whereas temptation is something the deceiver does to try and get us to act in a sinful way or in an evil manner. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think we need to recognize that God often tests us, and this is a good thing. It is our development, it is our growth, it is our spiritual nourishment. I mean, even in James, he says right before this, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. You have to believe and not doubt. And he goes on, actually, James 1:2, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. I feel like these trials are the sort of testing that God would often bring so that we can grow. And he says it's joy when you go through trials because you know the testing, right there, testing of your faith produces perseverance. And let perseverance finish its work so that it may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. See, James recognizes this work right here is something that God brings. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. He recognizes this is something that God brings into our lives. And he calls it testing, okay? Testing. And this produces faith and perseverance, and we become mature. But he's quick in the same chapter to say, now just because God tested us doesn't mean that he tempts us. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, the person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, however, one should not say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. And again, I was asked this question, so I wasn't asked this question. This question was brought up in a study I was in, but if God doesn't tempt anyone, then why do we have these accounts of him tempting? And the issue is, it's a difference between testing and tempting. God tempts us not to sin or evil, but instead to bring us trials, tests, and tribulations and difficulties so that we will grow. Yes, we grow in our faith and in resilience when we go through trials. Exactly right. So we should praise God, honestly, for trials, tribulations, and difficulties. We should praise God for those. Those are the tests that God brings into our lives so that we can grow. But if we ever feel tempted to sin, we know that's not from God, says James, because God would never tempt us to sin. Instead, we're carried away by our own evil desires, says James. So I just wanted to point out that difference because I think it's a question a lot of people have, and I want to have a brief discussion on it. And I think it was helpful, too, to go through, look at the original language, and kind of study it together. I think you guys offered great input as well. Thank you so much. So the key is, whether you want to call it tempting or testing, it's sin. God doesn't tempt or test us to sin. He tempts or tests our faith so that we'll grow in character. Hey guys, you know the drill. Like and subscribe button if you like that content, because we're trying to put out new content daily for you right here on YouTube. So go ahead and hit those notifications and we'll try to get it to you as soon as we can. Take care. God bless. Bye now.